Some of the most beautiful places I have seen were abandoned long ago, and also some of the ugliest. It can go either way, just like Icelandic food. It might be amazing, or it might just be death on a plate. Right now we look at beautiful abandoned places because that will get more views. No one would click on a video of ugly buildings. So from a mysterious castle to an entire capital city, here are the world's most beautiful abandoned wonders. This castle was once among the most important buildings in France. Built in the 13th century, it was home to a powerful noble family. It was twice captured by invading English, but each time returned to French lords. It was known as a grand and beautiful castle, but during the French Revolution it was almost completely destroyed. Luckily it was rebuilt and returned to its former glory. Unluckily, a 1932 fire destroyed it again. Since then it's been abandoned, left crumbling into its moat and for nature to reclaim it. Overgrown and in ruins, it's quite a sight. Angola's biggest island lies completely abandoned, but it wasn't an island until 1962 when the Atlantic Ocean broke into the peninsula, and so the area literally became an island overnight. There was a fishing village on the island which ironically was left without a water supply, so the population abandoned the island and their villages became ghost towns. Go there today and you'll find Portuguese-style buildings from Angola's colonial period, often sand-filled. Its human population seemingly replaced by bird life, with 33 birds per square kilometer. China's Wonderland amusement park was abandoned before its construction was finished. It was intended to be Asia's biggest amusement park, but in the late 90s, East Asia saw a massive financial crash. Many of the continent's most grand construction projects were halted and ultimately abandoned, like Bangkok's famously abandoned skyscraper. Much of the Wonderland structures were left standing, including the half-built castle. It was an eerily beautiful image, but was demolished a few years ago. Those behind the project wanted it to rival Disneyland, and maybe it would have. In Russia, there is a long history of building houses entirely out of wood, and from the late 10th century many wooden churches were built. In 1902, a photographer captured some of such churches. They had been abandoned, lost to time, and vandalized. The images were used on postcards in 1911, but the actual churches were never heard from again. Historians called them the lost churches. In 2002, a modern photographer set out to find them. He explored the loosely populated Russian north, much of which covered in thick woodland, and eventually he found them, or some of them at least. Many had been destroyed by lightning or forest fires, or simply collapsed into their wooden frames. Many of the buildings were actually built without nails, the wooden components carved to fit together perfectly. It was like massive building material origami. This deserted green village wasn't built by Wookiees. It was actually built by humans, and if you don't believe me, Google it. It wasn't long ago that it was a thriving fishing village, but as the fishing business became more seasonal, it made less sense to live there. The village was abandoned, as were others on the island. It's on one of almost 400 islands in China's Shaanxi region. The island still attracts 100,000 fishermen at the end of each year, but still the native villages remain uncared for, with nature slowly taking them over, disguising them with green vines and breaking their foundations with roots. I think it's obvious why this building was abandoned, because the neighbors were annoying. Actually, it's because the entire island is rapidly disappearing, and that's as good a reason to move away as any. It was once much bigger, being home to a fishing community in the mid-19th century. It became one of the area's most inhabited islands with over 300 people by 1900. The island had its own school, post office, neighborhoods, and even sports teams. It was a tight-knit community, and increasingly so. As the small islands began to erode and disappear, the islanders were forced more towards the center. Over time, the island's submergence only increased in speed. It continues today with just one building left, abandoned. Montserrat is a tiny Caribbean island with a total population below 5,000. Its capital city has a population of 0. It's a ghost town. In fact, it's the only place in the world to have a ghost town for a capital city. The capital is called Plymouth. It was abandoned in 1995 when a nearby volcano erupted. Most of Montserrat's population called Plymouth their home, but they were unable to return as most of it was either buried in ash or burnt. Today, much of the city remains buried in volcanic ash. If you awoke there one day, you might think you alone had survived the apocalypse. You'll see some other buildings that also survived, like colonial time capsules. It's amazing they never officially changed it from being their capital city. Underneath Chicago is a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels. Go down there today and you might expect to find massive mutant turtles, but the tunnels were built at the turn of the century for electrical storage. After being abandoned a first time, they were used to move coal and ventilate buildings across the city. Inevitably, it's said they were used by gangsters to transport illegal booze and drugs. The tunnels are now sealed, but if any of you find an access point, film that and send me the video. Off the coast of Oregon, now that's a place I never hear anything about. Off the coast of Oregon is an abandoned lighthouse called Tillamook. Built atop a large rock, its construction took 500 days. 500 days of misery as the waves and weather were so volatile. During construction, a ship was wrecked on the rocks below, killing 16 men. It's said today that the now abandoned lighthouse is haunted by the captain of that ship, angry that the lighthouse wasn't operational yet. Local legend tells he attacks anyone to visit the lighthouse. The only way to visit now is by helicopter. In a disused Kazakh bunker, this Soviet rocket has been abandoned for decades. Built in the 1970s, this monster rocket was built to launch space planes into orbit, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was, like many other Soviet relics, forgotten about. It still remains in the bunker like a space race time capsule left to rust. It weighs 5.3 million pounds, which might explain why it's just been left there. Imagine trying to move something so heavy. It's possible the rocket's engine could be used again in future space voyages, so this relic may soon be taken apart. Okay, that's the end of this video, and it was a glorious video if I do say myself. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd love for you to answer this question for me in the comments. And if you want even more content, you'll find interesting facts on my Instagram daily. You'll find bonus videos on my Facebook page, and that's also daily.